She was on her knees, scrubbing another man's blood off imported marble, when the most dangerous man in the city decided he wanted her. Not as a maid, not as a witness, as something far more terrifying, something he intended to own. Elena Vale had one rule left in life: survive long enough to keep her daughter fed. But rules don't mean a damn thing when you're kneeling at the feet of Lucien Moretti. And the thing about monsters? They don't ask permission before they fall in love. If you want to see how far this story goes, watch until the very end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Let's see how far Elena's story travels tonight. The rain came sideways that night, the kind of rain that didn't just fall but attacked, punching against windows, flooding gutters, turning the city into a blurred mess of headlights and broken reflections. Elena Vale sat in the back of a transit bus with her forehead pressed against cold glass, watching the water streak past like tears she refused to cry anymore. She was 24 years old. She had $37 in a checking account that overdrafted twice a month. She had a 3-year-old daughter asleep in a one-bedroom apartment across town with a neighbor who charged $15 an hour to babysit and didn't ask questions about the bruises. And she had a new job that started in 40 minutes at an address she'd never been to, working for people she'd never met, doing work she'd been told almost nothing about. The agency had called it private residential cleaning, high-end clientele, cash pay, no background check. Elena had stopped asking questions the moment they said cash. The bus lurched to a stop 3 blocks from the address. She pulled her jacket tighter, stepped into the storm, and started walking. The neighborhood changed fast. Strip malls gave way to iron gates. Cracked sidewalks turned to smooth stone curbs. By the time she reached the Ashcroft estate, she was soaked through, shivering, standing in front of a gate tall enough to make her feel like an insect. A camera swiveled toward her face. A buzzer sounded. The gate opened without a voice, without a greeting, without any indication that a human being had made the decision to let her in. The driveway alone was longer than the street she lived on. She walked it in the rain, shoes squelching against polished stone, until the mansion materialized out of the dark like something that didn't belong in this century. Columns, arched windows, warm amber light spilling from behind curtains that probably cost more than her annual rent. A man in a dark suit met her at the service entrance. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't shake her hand. He looked at her the way someone looks at a piece of furniture being delivered, checking for damage, nothing more. "You're the new one," he said. "Elena Vale. I know who you are. Come in. Don't touch anything you aren't told to touch. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't look at anyone directly unless they address you first." She almost laughed. Almost. But something in his voice, not anger, not cruelty, just a flat, practiced absence of warmth, told her this wasn't the kind of house where you laughed. He led her through a service corridor that smelled like lemon polish and something else underneath it. Something metallic. Something she recognized but couldn't name yet. The corridor opened into a grand foyer with ceilings high enough to echo. Marble floors stretched in every direction, pale and veined like the inside of something alive. A staircase curved upward into shadow. Somewhere above she could hear men's voices, low, controlled, the kind of conversation that happened behind closed doors for reasons that never made the news. The man in the suit handed her a bucket, a set of rags, and a pair of rubber gloves. "Third room on the left," he said. "The study. Clean the floor. All of it. Don't move anything on the desk. Don't open any drawers. When you're done, come find me." He walked away before she could respond. Elena carried the bucket down the hall, pushed open the heavy wooden door of the study, and stopped breathing. The floor was covered in blood. Not a little. Not a spatter. A wide, dark pool of it spread across the marble, already beginning to thicken at the edges, catching the lamplight with a dull, wet sheen. The smell hit her next, iron and copper and something rotten beneath it, the smell of a body leaking what it was never supposed to lose. There was no body, just the blood, just the evidence that something terrible had happened in this room not long ago, and someone had decided that the appropriate response was to call a cleaning agency. Elena's hands shook. Her stomach rolled. She pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and breathed through the thin fabric of her sleeve until the nausea passed. She thought about Rosie. She thought about the $15 an hour ticking away on the babysitter's clock. She thought about the electricity bill she hadn't paid in 2 months, and the landlord's voice on her answering machine saying final notice with a patience that had already run out. Then she put on the gloves, got on her knees, and started scrubbing. The blood came up slowly. It had soaked into the grain of the marble, settled into the fine cracks, stained the grout between tiles. She worked in silence, wringing the rags into the bucket until the water turned the color of rust, dumping it, refilling, starting again. Her shoulders burned. Her knees ached against the hard floor. Sweat ran down her temples despite the cold. She was halfway through the room when she heard footsteps behind her. Not the sharp, hurried steps of the man in the suit. These were slower, deliberate, the kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who had never once in his life needed to rush. Elena didn't turn around. The rules had been clear. Don't look at anyone directly unless they address you first. But she felt him, the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm breaks. The air in the room shifted, thickened, became something heavier. He stopped somewhere behind her, close enough that she could hear him breathing, close enough that if she reached back, her hand would find him. For a long time he said nothing. Elena kept scrubbing. Her hands trembled. The rag moved in tight, mechanical circles against the marble. She could feel his gaze on the back of her neck like a physical thing, like a hand hovering just above her skin, not quite touching, not quite letting go. "You're new." His voice was quiet, low, the kind of quiet that didn't come from softness, but from absolute certainty that the world would shut up and listen regardless. "Yes, sir," Elena said without looking up. "What's your name?" Elena Vale. Silence. She heard him shift his weight, heard the faint creak of expensive shoes on marble. "Elena," he repeated, as though testing how the word felt in his mouth. "Look at me." She didn't want to. Every instinct she had, every survival mechanism hardwired into her body after years of learning exactly what happened when powerful men paid attention to her, screamed at her to keep her eyes down, to stay small, to be invisible. But the voice didn't leave room for disobedience. She looked up. Lucien Moretti stood 6 feet from her, backlit by the amber glow of a desk lamp, and the first thing Elena thought was that the word handsome was completely wrong for him. Handsome was too polite, too safe. Lucien Moretti looked like something carved out of a harder material than other men. Sharp jaw, dark eyes set deep beneath a heavy brow. Black hair pushed back from a face that held no warmth and no apology. He wore a tailored black suit with the jacket unbuttoned, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms roped with muscle and marked with pale scars that told stories she was never supposed to read. His hands were the worst part, large, scarred across the knuckles, perfectly still at his sides, hands that had done things the blood on his floor only hinted at. He studied her the way a surgeon studies an X-ray, clinically, thoroughly, with no emotion and absolute focus. "You're shaking," he said. "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine. I said you're shaking." Elena swallowed hard. "It's cold in here." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not amusement exactly, but something adjacent to it. A recognition that she was lying, and a quiet, almost imperceptible respect for the attempt. "How old are you?" he asked. 24. "You have a child." It wasn't a question. Elena's blood went cold. "How do you know that?" Lucien tilted his head slightly. "You have formula stains on the inside of your left cuff. Your shoes are a size too large, which means you bought them secondhand, which means your money goes somewhere more important than your own feet. And you're scrubbing a stranger's blood off a floor at 11 o'clock at night without calling the police, which means someone depends on you badly enough that you'll swallow anything to bring a paycheck home." He said it without cruelty, without judgment, like he was reading facts off a page. Elena's throat tightened. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to tell him to go to hell, but anger was a luxury she hadn't been able to afford in years. "A daughter," she said quietly. "Her name is Rosie. She's 3. "And her father?" Elena's hand stopped moving. The rag sat motionless in the puddle of diluted blood. She could feel the scar tissue on her back pulling tight beneath her shirt, the old burns that Marcus had given her during her pregnancy. Punishment for refusing to end it. Punishment for daring to bring a life into the world without his permission. "He's gone," she said. The word came out flat, empty, scraped of everything beneath it. Lucien watched her for another long moment. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick envelope, and set it on the edge of the desk. "Finish the floor," he said. "That's yours when you're done. Come back tomorrow night, same time." He turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps fading down the corridor until the silence swallowed them whole. Elena stared at the envelope. She didn't touch it until the floor was spotless, until every trace of blood had been lifted from the marble and the room smelled like nothing but chemicals and clean stone. Then she peeled off the gloves, opened the envelope, and counted the bills inside. $2,000. Her vision blurred. She pressed her hand against her mouth and breathed, hard, ragged breaths that shook her entire chest. Because crying was another luxury she couldn't afford. But the relief was too enormous to hold inside her body. She took the money. She went home. She paid the babysitter, kissed Rosie's sleeping forehead, and lay awake in the dark until dawn, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that the tightness in her chest was fear. She went back the next night, and the night after that. The work was legitimate, if that word meant anything inside the walls of the Ashcroft estate. She cleaned, she organized, she polished surfaces and arranged rooms and pretended not to notice the things that lived in the margins. The men who came and went at odd hours, the conversations that died the moment she entered a room, the occasional smell of gunpowder mixed with cologne. She pretended not to notice Lucien Moretti watching her, but he was always watching. He never approached her the way other men had, never cornered her in hallways, never made the kind of comments that required her to pretend she hadn't heard them. He simply existed in her periphery like gravity, invisible, inescapable, constantly pulling. And then strange things began happening. 3 days after she started, Elena came home to find 4 bags of groceries sitting outside her apartment door. Good groceries. Fresh produce, whole milk, the kind of organic baby food she saw other mothers buy at the store and put back because she couldn't justify the price. No note, no delivery receipt, just food, left as though it had materialized from nothing. The next week, a letter arrived from the hospital where Rosie had been treated for an ear infection 2 months ago. The bill, $412 that Elena had been paying off in agonizing $20 installments, had been paid in full. The letter thanked her for her prompt payment. Elena hadn't paid it. She knew she hadn't paid it. Then came the clothes. A box arrived with no return address containing winter coats, boots, thick socks, and a small stuffed elephant with a ribbon around its neck. All in Rosie's size. All brand new. Rosie clutched the elephant and wouldn't let go of it for 3 days straight. Elena told herself it was the agency, some kind of employee benefit, a charity program she hadn't been told about. She told herself anything except the truth, because the truth was a door she didn't want to open. The truth came for her anyway. It was a Thursday night, 2 weeks into the job. Elena was polishing the banister on the second-floor landing when she heard Lucien's voice coming from the study below. The same study where she'd scrubbed blood from the floor on her first night. He was speaking to someone on the phone, his tone flat, businesslike, stripped of anything that resembled human warmth. She wasn't trying to listen. Sound carried in that house the way secrets carried in small towns. Effortlessly, inevitably. The medical debt is handled. Set up an account at Mariano's on West Division. Weekly delivery. Full stock, nothing cheap. And get the girl enrolled at Bright Futures on Lakeshore. Tuition's covered through the year. A pause, then quieter. Because I said so, that's why. Elena stood motionless on the landing, her hand frozen on the banister, her heartbeat so loud she was certain he could hear it 2 floors below. He knew about Rosie's school. He knew which grocery store was closest to her apartment. He knew the exact amount of her medical debt. Lucien Moretti had been studying her life the way he studied everything else, with terrifying precision and absolute thoroughness. She should have been afraid. She should have walked out that night and never come back. Instead, she finished polishing the banister, collected her pay, and went home to find the refrigerator already full. She fed Rosie dinner. She gave her a bath. She read her a story and tucked her in and waited until the child's breathing went slow and even before she sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and tried to understand why the most dangerous feeling in the world wasn't fear. It was gratitude. Because gratitude was a debt. And debts to men like Lucien Moretti always came due. 2 more weeks passed. Elena learned the rhythms of the house the way animals learn the rhythms of a forest. Which sounds meant danger, which silences were safe, which rooms to avoid after midnight. She learned that Lucien drank his coffee black and standing up, never sitting. She learned that he read for exactly 1 hour every night before bed, always history, never fiction. She learned that the scar on his left hand ran from the base of his thumb to his wrist, and that he touched it sometimes when he thought no one was looking, pressing his fingers into the raised tissue like he was reading something written there in a language only he understood. She learned that when he entered a room, men straightened their spines and lowered their voices. She learned that his anger wasn't the explosive kind. No yelling, no throwing things, no red-faced eruptions. His anger was the opposite. It was stillness, a terrifying, compressed quiet that made the air feel thin, like standing at high altitude, and the men around him responded to it the way prey responds to the shadow of something circling overhead. She learned all of this because she couldn't stop watching him either. And then came the night that changed everything. Elena was working late, restocking the library shelves on the 3rd floor, when her sleeve caught on a shelf bracket and tore. The fabric ripped from cuff to collar, exposing the length of her left arm, her shoulder, and the upper portion of her back. She didn't hear him come in. Elena. She spun around, clutching the torn fabric against her body, but it was too late. Lucien stood in the doorway of the library, and his eyes had already found what the shirt had been hiding. The burns. 4 of them. Circular, deliberate, spaced evenly across her upper back like brands on livestock. The skin was thick and ridged, healed badly, the kind of scars that came from something pressed against flesh and held there long enough to cook. Lucien's face didn't change. Not exactly, but something behind it shifted, something deep and structural, like watching the foundation of a building crack without the walls moving yet. "Who did that to you?" His voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. The kind of quiet that preceded the worst things he was capable of. "It doesn't matter." "That's not what I asked." Elena's chin trembled. She pressed her lips together until the trembling stopped. "Someone who isn't in my life anymore." His name. Lucien. His name, Elena. She could feel it. The pull of his voice. The gravitational force of a man who did not accept unanswered questions, who had built an empire on the principle that information was power and silence was a luxury no one was permitted in his presence. "Marcus," she whispered. "Marcus Kane. Rosie's father." Something passed through Lucien's eyes then. Not surprise, not pity. Something older and colder and infinitely more dangerous. The look of a man who had just added a name to a list that very few people survived being on. He crossed the room. Elena flinched, not because she thought he would hurt her, but because proximity to powerful men had taught her body to recoil before her brain could intervene. Lucien stopped. He saw the flinch. He registered it the way he registered everything. Completely, precisely, without a single detail lost. Then he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched the scar on her back with 2 fingers. His touch was so light she barely felt it, just the warmth of his skin against the dead nerve endings of the scar tissue. A sensation that shouldn't have been possible, but was. Elena stopped breathing. "No one," Lucien said quietly, his fingers still resting against her ruined skin, "will ever do this to you again." It wasn't a promise. Promises were fragile things made by ordinary men who meant well and failed often. What Lucien spoke was something else entirely. A statement of fact delivered with the same certainty he brought to everything, as though the universe itself would rearrange to accommodate his will. Elena should have run. She should have grabbed Rosie and disappeared into the vast anonymity of the city and never looked back. Instead, she stood in the amber light of the library with a torn shirt and exposed scars, and felt something terrifying crack open inside her chest, something she had sealed shut years ago and sworn never to unseal. Trust, not the complete kind. Not yet. But the first fracture in the wall, the first hairline break in the armor she had built around herself with years of pain and silence. She went home that night with Lucien's touch still burning on her skin like a ghost that refused to leave. 3 days later, Lucien called her into the study. He stood behind his desk with his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable, his voice stripped to its most essential register. "I want you and Rosie to move into the East Wing." Elena stared at him. "What?" "The East Wing. Private entrance, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen. Rosie would have a garden to play in. Security around the clock. Everything provided. I can't do that. You can, and you should. Lucien, I'm your cleaning lady. You were my cleaning lady. Now you're something else. What am I? He looked at her for a long moment. The silence in the room was enormous, heavy with everything neither of them had said yet. Someone I don't intend to let anyone hurt again. Elena wanted to argue. She wanted to list every rational reason this was insane. She barely knew him. He was a criminal. She had a child to think about. This was too fast, too strange, too dangerous. But rational reasons required a rational world. And Elena hadn't lived in a rational world since she was 19 years old and the man she loved put a cigarette out on her spine for the first time. She thought about Rosie's cough that wouldn't go away. She thought about the lock on her apartment door that didn't work properly. She thought about Marcus, somewhere out there in the world, and the way fear tasted in the back of her throat every time she heard footsteps behind her on a dark street. Then she looked at Lucien Moretti, scarred hands, dark eyes, the most dangerous man in a city full of dangerous men, and made the most irrational decision of her life. Okay, she said. The word barely made a sound, but Lucien heard it, and something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not relief, but something raw and unguarded that appeared for half a second before he buried it beneath his usual composure. He nodded once. I'll send someone for your things tomorrow. And just like that, Elena Vale's life crossed a line she could never uncross. She didn't know it yet, couldn't possibly know it yet, but somewhere across the city, in a rented room above a bar in the old waterfront district, a man named Marcus Kane was looking at a photograph of a 3-year-old girl with dark curls and her mother's frightened eyes. And he was smiling. The East Wing smelled like fresh paint and someone else's money. Elena stood in the doorway of the master bedroom with Rosie on her hip, staring at a space larger than her entire apartment. King-sized bed. Egyptian cotton sheets. She could tell by the thread count, by the way the fabric caught the light like water instead of cloth. A walk-in closet already stocked with clothes in her size, tags still attached, brands she'd only ever seen through store windows. Beyond the window, a private garden stretched out in manicured green, bordered by stone walls high enough to block the street, and everything ugly that lived on it. Rosie squirmed against her chest, reaching toward the window. Mama, trees. Yeah, baby, trees. Elena set her daughter down and watched her toddle toward the glass with that reckless, stumbling joy that only 3-year-olds possess. The complete absence of suspicion, the inability to understand that beautiful things can also be cages. A woman appeared behind her, mid-50s, gray hair pulled tight, pressed uniform, hands clasped in front of her like she'd been standing that way her entire life. I'm Agatha. I manage the household. If you need anything at all, you come to me. Not to Mr. Moretti's staff, not to the security team, to me. Elena turned. Thank you. Agatha studied her with eyes that had clearly spent decades cataloging the women who passed through this house. The assessment wasn't hostile, but it wasn't warm either. It was the look of someone who had seen this before and was already calculating how it would end. Dinner is at 7, Agatha said. Mr. Moretti eats in the main dining room. You're welcome to join him or eat separately in the East Wing kitchen. Most people choose separately. Most people? Agatha's expression didn't change. Will there be anything else? The question hung in the air like a door closing. Elena shook her head. Agatha disappeared down the hallway without a sound, and Elena was alone again with her daughter and the suffocating luxury of a life she hadn't earned. She ate separately that first night, and the second, and the third. On the fourth night, Lucien appeared at the East Wing door at exactly 7 o'clock. No knock. Just his presence filling the doorframe, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled, a bottle of wine in one hand, and something Elena had never seen on his face before. Uncertainty. It lasted less than a second. A flicker behind the dark eyes, a microtension along his jaw. The kind of vulnerability that men like Lucien buried so fast it left bruises on the inside. You've been avoiding me, he said. I've been settling in. For 4 days. It's a big room. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Something closer to acknowledgement. The recognition that she wasn't afraid of him the way other people were afraid of him, and that this fact both pleased and unsettled him in equal measure. Have dinner with me, he said. Not a command. Not quite a request either. something occupying the narrow, uncomfortable space between the two. Elena looked at Rosie, who was on the kitchen floor stacking plastic cups into a tower that kept collapsing. The child hadn't cried once since they'd moved in, hadn't woken up screaming from nightmares about loud voices through thin walls, hadn't clung to Elena's legs with that desperate animal grip that said the world is too big and too loud and I need you to be the wall between me and everything. Rosie was humming, building her tower, content. Elena looked back at Lucien. Okay. They ate in the main dining room beneath a chandelier that probably cost more than Elena's entire education. Lucien sat at the head of a table designed for 20, and Elena sat to his right, and the distance between them felt both enormous and non-existent. He didn't make small talk. Elena learned quickly that Lucien considered small talk a form of lying, a way to fill silence with noise to avoid the discomfort of truth. Instead, he asked questions, direct, unpadded, sometimes uncomfortably precise questions. What did you study before you dropped out? Elena set down her fork. Who said I dropped out? You read faster than anyone I've ever watched shelf books. You organize information instinctively, and you have a scar on your right index finger from a dissection scalpel. Pre-med? She stared at him. Nursing. I was 18 months from finishing when I got pregnant. And Marcus didn't let you go back. It wasn't a question. Elena didn't answer it. Where is he now? Lucien asked. His voice hadn't changed. Same flat, controlled register. But something beneath it had. A tension, like a wire being slowly pulled taut. I don't know. He left when Rosie was 4 months old. Disappeared. I filed a police report. They didn't care. A man abandons his kid, the system shrugs. It's not a crime to walk away. It should be. Lots of things should be. Lucien looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't decode. Not pity, she was sure of that. Lucien Moretti didn't do pity. Something else, something that looked almost like recognition, like he was seeing a version of damage he understood from the inside. My mother died when I was 9, he said. The words came out flat, factual, delivered the way someone reads a grocery list. My father was killed in front of me when I was 12. I was raised by a man named Sal Ferrante, who taught me that the only thing weaker than grief is the person who shows it. Elena's chest tightened. Lucien, I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because I need you to understand something. He leaned forward slightly. The candlelight caught the scar on his left hand. I know what it's like to survive people who were supposed to protect you, and I know what it costs. So when I tell you that no one will hurt you or your daughter again, I need you to understand that I'm not making a gesture. I'm making a decision, and I don't reverse my decisions. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the hallway and the distant sound of rain beginning again outside. Elena should have said thank you, should have nodded politely and returned to the east wing and maintained the careful professional distance that was the only sane response to this situation. Instead, she said, What do you want from me, Lucien? The question landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Lucien didn't flinch, didn't deflect. He looked at her with those black eyes and said, I don't know yet, and that's what terrifies me. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. The weeks that followed were a strange, suspended kind of existence, like living inside a held breath. Elena and Rosie settled into the rhythms of the mansion, and the mansion reluctantly settled around them. Rosie adapted with the terrifying ease of young children. Within days, she had claimed the garden as her personal kingdom, conducting elaborate negotiations with imaginary subjects among the rose bushes. She named the stone fountain Mr. Bubbles and had lengthy conversations with him every morning. She discovered that the kitchen staff would give her cookies if she stood in the doorway and stared at them with enough intensity, and she weaponized this discovery with ruthless efficiency. Lucien noticed Rosie before Rosie noticed Lucien. Elena watched it happen in increments. The way he paused at the window overlooking the garden and stood there longer than a man with his schedule could justify. The way a wooden swing set appeared in the garden overnight. Professional grade, cedar, sanded smooth, without anyone acknowledging its existence. The way a shelf of children's books materialized in the East Wing living room, curated with a specificity that suggested someone had researched developmental reading levels for 3-year-olds. But Lucien kept his distance from the child. Elena understood why. He moved through the world like a weapon, controlled, precise, dangerous. And weapons didn't know how to be gentle with small things. He watched Rosie the way someone watches a fire through glass, drawn to the warmth, but acutely aware that getting too close would burn something. It was Rosie who closed the distance. Elena was in the East Wing kitchen making dinner when she heard Rosie's voice carrying down the hallway from the main house. Not crying, not afraid. Just the relentless, unfiltered narration that 3-year-olds produce when they've found something interesting. She followed the sound to Lucien's study. The door was open. Lucien sat behind his desk with a phone in his hand, mid-conversation, his face locked in that mask of professional detachment he wore when conducting business. Rosie stood in the middle of the room, holding the stuffed elephant by one ear, staring up at him with enormous brown eyes. "You're big," Rosie said. Lucien looked at the child, then at Elena in the doorway, then back at the child. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, and hung up without waiting for a response. "You're really big," Rosie repeated, as though his size were a personal failing she was generously willing to overlook. "Do you want to see my elephant?" She held up the stuffed animal, the same one that had arrived in the anonymous box of clothes weeks ago. Its ribbon was gone. One ear was chewed. It had clearly been subjected to the kind of aggressive affection that only toddlers can deliver. Lucien stared at the elephant. Something happened to his face that Elena had never seen before. A crack in the architecture, a momentary collapse of the structure that held everything in place. He looked like a man who had been punched in a place he didn't know he could be reached. "What's his name?" Lucien asked. His voice was rough. "Gerald." "Gerald. He's brave. He fights monsters." Lucien swallowed. The movement was visible in his throat. "Does he win?" Rosie considered this with the gravity of a military strategist. Sometimes the monsters are really big, but Gerald doesn't give up because giving up is for losers. Elena pressed her hand against the doorframe. Her eyes burned. Lucien looked at the child standing in his study, this tiny, fearless human who had walked into the room of the most dangerous man in the city and offered him a chewed stuffed elephant, and something fundamental rearranged itself behind his eyes. "Gerald sounds like someone I'd want on my team," he said quietly. Rosie beamed. She crossed the room, climbed uninvited into the leather chair beside his desk, and began explaining Gerald's entire backstory with the breathless intensity of someone delivering critical intelligence. Lucien listened, not the way adults usually listen to children, with half attention and performed enthusiasm. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely. Elena watched from the doorway and felt the last piece of her resistance crack and fall away like ice breaking from a rooftop in spring. She was falling. She knew she was falling, and the ground below was made of things that could destroy her. But the fall itself felt like the first honest thing she'd done in years. The cracks in their careful arrangement started 2 weeks later, and they started from the outside. Dominic Voss was Lucien's right hand, his underboss, his strategist, his oldest surviving friend. He was lean where Lucien was broad, quick where Lucien was deliberate, and he smiled constantly in a way that never reached his eyes. Elena had seen him around the house, always watching, always calculating, always performing a loyalty that felt rehearsed rather than felt. He cornered her in the hallway outside the kitchen on a Tuesday morning. "So," Dominic said, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and a cigarette tucked behind his ear. "You're the new project." Elena stopped walking. "Excuse me?" "Lucien's project, his charity case, whatever you want to call it." Dominic's smile widened. "Don't take it personally. He does this. Finds something broken, decides to fix it, gets obsessed. It's very noble." "I'm not broken." "Sure you're not. You're a single mom who was scrubbing blood off floors for cash 3 weeks ago, and now you're sleeping in a mansion. Nothing broken about that story at all." The words landed where they were meant to land, right in the soft, unprotected center of every doubt Elena already carried. She felt her face go hot, felt the old familiar shame crawl up her spine like something with legs. "What do you want, Dominic? I want you to understand how this works." He pushed off the wall and stepped closer. Not threatening exactly, but occupying space in a way that made the hallway feel narrower. Lucien runs an empire. People depend on him. Decisions he makes, good decisions, rational decisions keep people alive. And right now his attention is on you, which means it's not on business, which means people who depend on his focus are exposed. That's not my problem. It's everybody's problem, including yours, because the second his enemies figure out he has a weakness, and you are a weakness, Elena, you and that little girl, they'll come for you. And Lucien will do something stupid to protect you. And stupid gets people killed in this world. Elena's jaw tightened. She could feel her pulse in her temples, could feel the adrenaline dumping into her bloodstream the way it always did when a man stood too close and spoke too precisely about her vulnerabilities. Are you threatening me? I'm educating you. There's a difference. It doesn't feel like one. Dominic studied her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. The smile dropped, and what remained underneath was harder and more honest. I've known Lucien since we were 15 years old, he said quietly. I have watched him build everything he has from absolutely nothing. I've watched him survive things that would have killed anyone else. And I have never, not once, not ever, seen him look at anything the way he looks at you. That scares me. Because I know what happens when a man like Lucien Moretti loves something. The entire world pays the price. He turned and walked away before Elena could respond. She stood alone in the hallway for a long time, her hands shaking, Dominic's words circling inside her skull like trapped birds. She didn't tell Lucien about the conversation. She should have. She knew she should have. But telling Lucien would mean acknowledging what Dominic had seen. And acknowledging what Dominic had seen would mean admitting it to herself. And admitting it to herself would mean accepting that she was already far deeper into this than survival, far deeper than gratitude, far deeper than the transactional arrangement she kept telling herself this was. So she said nothing. And the silence grew teeth. 2 days later, Lucien came home at 3 a.m. Elena heard him from the east wing, not his footsteps, but the absence of them. The house went quiet in a specific way when Lucien was in it, as though the building itself held its breath. She found him in the kitchen, jacket off, shirt untucked, a glass of whiskey in his hand and his eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. Some middle distance beyond the walls, beyond the house, beyond the present moment. There was blood on his knuckles, not his own. She could tell because there were no cuts, no swelling, just the dark, dried stain of someone else's damage painted across his skin. You should be asleep, he said without looking at her. I heard you come in. You shouldn't be able to hear me come in. I'll talk to the security team about the East Wing insulation. Lucien, your hands! He looked down at his knuckles as though noticing the blood for the first time. Then he turned on the faucet, ran his hands under the water, and watched the blood dissolve and spiral down the drain in pale pink ribbons. Bad night? Elena asked. There are no good nights in my line of work. There are only nights that end. What happened? He turned off the water, dried his hands on a kitchen towel, folded the towel precisely and set it on the counter. Every movement controlled, deliberate, mechanical. The habits of a man who managed chaos by imposing order on every small thing within his reach. Someone stole from me, he said, a significant amount. From a revenue stream that funds 3 neighborhoods worth of infrastructure, housing repairs, school supplies, medical clinics, things that don't exist without that money. And you dealt with it. I dealt with it. And the blood belongs to someone who made a very poor decision and received a very clear education about the consequences. Elena leaned against the counter. She was wearing an old t-shirt and sweatpants, her hair pulled back, her face bare. She looked like exactly what she was, a tired young mother standing in a kitchen at 3 a.m, trying to understand the man in front of her. Does it bother you? She asked quietly. Lucien looked at her. Does what bother me? Hurting people. The silence that followed was different from his usual silences. This one had weight. This one pressed against the walls. It used to, he said finally, when I was young enough to believe that the world operated on fairness, that good behavior was rewarded and bad behavior was punished by some natural order. Then I watched my father die in our kitchen because he owed money to a man who didn't believe in payment plans. I was 12. I held his hand while he bled out on linoleum, and I learned something that night that I've never been able to unlearn. He paused. His fingers pressed against the scar on his left hand. Mercy is a luxury, he said, and I grew up too poor to afford it. Elena felt something shift inside her chest. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. The bone-deep understanding of what it meant to have your innocence stripped away by violence you didn't choose and couldn't stop. She reached out and took his hand, the scarred one. She held it between both of hers and felt the tension in his fingers, the coiled readiness that never left him, the permanent vigilance of a man who had learned as a child that the world would take everything from you the moment you relaxed. Lucien looked at their joined hands, then at her face. And for the second time since she'd known him, she saw that crack in the architecture, that momentary collapse of everything he'd built to keep the world at distance. "Elena," he said. Her name in his mouth sounded like something being surrendered. "I know," she said. "I know." Neither of them moved. The kitchen clock ticked. The rain continued outside, and somewhere in the space between their breathing, something irrevocable took root. Elena didn't kiss him that night. Lucien didn't try. They stood in the kitchen holding hands across the counter like two people standing on opposite sides of a fault line, feeling the ground tremble beneath them, knowing that what came next would change the geography of everything. She went back to the East Wing. She lay down next to Rosie and listened to her daughter breathe and tried to catalog the exact moment she'd lost control of this. When survival had become attachment, when attachment had become need, when need had started to resemble something she swore she'd never be stupid enough to feel again. She couldn't find the moment. It had happened the way landslides happen. Not all at once, but in 1,000 small shifts that only become visible when the entire hillside is already gone. The landslide was complete. She was at the bottom of it, and the only question left was whether what she'd landed on was solid ground or quicksand. The answer came 3 days later, and it came wearing a tailored suit and a smile that Elena recognized the way burn victims recognize the smell of smoke. She was in the garden with Rosie, watching her daughter chase butterflies through the lavender, when a black sedan pulled through the estate gates. The car was expensive, but not ostentatious. The kind of vehicle chosen by someone who wanted to project authority without attracting attention. 2 men got out. One was thick, heavy, clearly muscle. The other was lean, average height, with sandy hair going gray at the temples and a face that time had treated with undeserved kindness. Elena's blood turned to ice. She knew that face. She knew the way it smiled, slowly, charitably, as though the world were a gift he was graciously allowing to exist. She knew the way it could shift from warmth to emptiness in the space between heartbeats, the way the eyes could go from soft to dead while the mouth kept smiling. Marcus Kane walked across the gravel drive, adjusted his cufflinks, and looked directly at Elena standing frozen in the garden with their daughter playing at her feet. He smiled. "Hello, Elena," he said. "You look wonderful, truly." Rosie stopped chasing butterflies. She looked at the stranger, then at her mother, then back at the stranger. Elena couldn't breathe. Her lungs had locked. Her vision had narrowed to a tunnel with Marcus at the end of it, and somewhere in the back of her brain, in the primitive reptilian part that remembered everything the conscious mind tried to bury, she could feel the ghost of a lit cigarette pressing against her spine. "Mama?" Rosie said. "Who's that man?" Elena grabbed her daughter's hand so hard Rosie yelped, and at that exact moment, through the study window above the garden, Lucien Moretti looked down and saw the man standing on his property, the woman frozen in terror, and the child gripping her mother's hand like a lifeline thrown from a sinking ship. His hand tightened around the glass he was holding until the crystal cracked straight down the middle, whiskey and blood running together between his fingers, and every light in the house seemed to dim. The crystal glass split in Lucien's hand like a bone breaking under too much pressure. Whiskey and blood pooled in his palm, dripped between his fingers onto the windowsill, and he didn't feel it. Didn't register the sting of sliced skin or the warmth running down his wrist. Every nerve in his body had redirected itself toward the garden below, toward the man standing on gravel that belonged to Lucien, breathing air that existed because Lucien permitted it to exist, smiling at a woman and child who were under Lucien's protection in a way that went beyond contracts, beyond territory, beyond anything he had language for. He set the broken glass down carefully, picked a shard from his palm, wrapped his hand in the handkerchief from his breast pocket without looking at the wound. Then he walked out of the study, down the main staircase, through the foyer, and out the front entrance into the garden with a stride that made 2 of his security men instinctively reach for their weapons. He didn't signal them to stand down. He didn't signal them to do anything. His attention was a laser, and it was fixed entirely on the man with sandy hair and a smile built for courtrooms. Marcus saw him coming. His smile didn't falter. If anything, it widened. The practiced, infuriating grin of a man who had spent his entire life skating across the surface of consequences without ever falling through. "Mr. Moretti," Marcus said, extending his hand. "Marcus Kane. I believe we have something to discuss." Lucien stopped 3 feet away. He didn't look at the extended hand. He looked at Marcus's face the way a butcher looks at a carcass, assessing where to make the first cut. "Elena," Lucien said without turning his head, "take Rosie inside." Elena hadn't moved. She stood rooted in the garden with Rosie's hand crushed in hers, her face the color of old paper, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid bursts that meant her body was deciding between running and collapsing. "Elena!" Lucien's voice dropped half a register, not louder, denser. "Inside, now!" She moved. Some survival circuit in her brain overrode the paralysis, and she scooped Rosie onto her hip and walked toward the house without looking back, her shoes crunching against gravel. Rosie's confused voice asking Mama, "What's wrong?" "Mama, who is that man, Mama?" "Why are you squeezing me so hard?" The questions fading as the front door opened and Agatha appeared and pulled them both inside. The door closed. Lucien and Marcus stood alone in the garden. The bodyguard who'd arrived with Marcus shifted his weight. Lucien's security, 3 men positioned at intervals along the drive, watched the bodyguard the way dogs watch a cat that's wandered into the wrong yard. "Bold of you," Lucien said quietly. "Coming here. I have every right to be here. Rosie is my daughter. Rosie is a child you tortured her mother for trying to bring into the world." Marcus's smile thinned, just slightly. A millimeter of adjustment that most people would have missed, but Lucien cataloged with the precision of a man who'd spent his life reading faces for lies. "I don't know what Elena told you," Marcus said, "but she has a tendency toward exaggeration, especially when it serves her narrative. The burns on her back exaggerate nothing. I'm not here to relitigate the past, Mr. Moretti. I'm here because I have a legal right to see my child, and I intend to exercise that right." Marcus reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately, aware of the armed men watching, and produced a manila envelope. He held it out. "Paternity confirmation, custody petition filed with the family court of Cook County. I've retained counsel. The process is already underway." Lucien didn't take the envelope. He stared at it the way someone stares at an insect that's landed on their food. "You abandoned that child," Lucien said. 3 years ago, walked out when she was 4 months old, filed no claim, paid no support, made no contact. People change." "No, they don't. The court will decide that. Not you." Silence. The garden felt smaller suddenly, the stone walls pressing inward, the sky lowering. Lucien's jaw was set so tight, the muscle in his cheek twitched visibly, a small, involuntary spasm that his body produced when his mind was calculating violence and his discipline was holding the leash. "Get off my property," Lucien said. "I'll leave, but I'll be back, with officers if necessary." Marcus tucked the envelope back into his jacket and adjusted his tie with fingers that were clean and smooth and had never once, as far as Lucien could tell, done an honest day's work. "My attorney will be in touch. I trust you'll cooperate." He turned and walked toward the sedan. His bodyguard followed. The car doors opened, closed. The engine started. The vehicle rolled down the driveway and disappeared through the gates. Lucien stood in the garden until the sound of the engine faded completely. Then he looked down at his wrapped hand. Blood had soaked through the handkerchief, spreading in a slow red bloom across the white fabric. He unwrapped it, looked at the cut, deep enough to need stitches. He flexed his fingers, watched the wound open and close like a mouth, and felt nothing. Then he went inside to find Elena. She was in the East Wing bedroom. Rosie was with Agatha in the kitchen, distracted by cookies and cartoons. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, with her arms wrapped around her own torso, holding herself together the way you hold a cracked vessel, carefully, knowing that any additional pressure would shatter it. Lucien closed the door behind him. He didn't sit. He stood across the room and gave her the distance he knew she needed, the space to breathe, to think, to exist without the pressure of his proximity. "Tell me everything," he said. From the beginning. Elena's voice came out broken. Not crying, past crying, in that territory beyond tears where the body is too exhausted for the luxury of release. I met Marcus when I was 18. He was 29. I was in nursing school. He was charming, generous, made me feel like I was the only person in any room. She paused, swallowed. It started small, comments about what I wore, who I talked to, checking my phone when I was in the shower. Then it got bigger. He'd show up at my classes unannounced, follow me to study groups, accuse me of things I hadn't done with people I barely knew. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them between her knees to stop the trembling. The first time he hit me, I was 19. We'd been together 8 months. I told myself it was a mistake. He told me it was a mistake. We both lied. She exhaled. The hitting got worse. Then it became other things, burning. He used cigarettes, held them against my skin when I did something he considered disobedient, 4 times. 4 burns. He was precise about it, methodical, like he was marking territory. Lucien stood absolutely still. His breathing hadn't changed. His posture hadn't shifted. But Elena had learned to read the temperature of a room by now, and the temperature of this room had dropped to something Arctic. When I got pregnant, he wanted me to end it. I refused. That's when the burns happened, the ones on my back. He said if I was going to ruin his life with a child, he'd make sure I carried the reminder on my body forever. Her voice cracked on the last word. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and breathed through it. I ran when I was 7 months pregnant, stayed with my cousin for 2 weeks. Marcus found me, came to the door calm, polite, apologetic. My cousin believed him. Everyone always believed him. He has this way of making you feel like you're the crazy one, like the violence was a misunderstanding and you're being dramatic for remembering it. He took me back. The last 2 months of the pregnancy were the worst. He didn't touch me, not physically. He just controlled everything, what I ate, when I slept, who I called. I delivered Rosie alone in a hospital room while Marcus sat in the waiting area and read a magazine. She stopped. Her jaw tightened. Something harder moved across her face, replacing the vulnerability with a thin, brittle shell. He stayed 4 months after Rosie was born. Then one morning I woke up and he was gone. No note, no call, just gone. I spent 3 weeks terrified he'd come back. When he didn't, I spent 3 years terrified of when he would. She looked at Lucien. And now he has. Lucien was quiet for a long time. Not the performative silence of a man pretending to process. The genuine silence of a man whose mind operated like industrial machinery, taking raw material and converting it into something precise and functional and potentially devastating. The custody petition, he said finally. Does he have grounds? He's her biological father. He was never charged with anything. I never filed for a restraining order because I was too scared he'd retaliate. On paper, he's a man who left and now wants to come back. The courts see that every day. On paper. On paper, Lucien, he's a concerned father who made mistakes and wants a second chance. That's how he'll play it. That's how he always plays it. And he'll be good at it because he's been practicing that performance his entire life. Lucien crossed the room. He sat on the bed beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, the dense physicality of a man who occupied space the way continents occupy oceans. He's not getting near her, Lucien said. You don't control the courts. I control more than you think. Lucien, this isn't something you can solve with money or intimidation. Family court has rules, due process. He has legal standing whether we like it or not. Then we'll fight him legally. With what? I can't afford a lawyer. I can barely afford to exist. I can afford an army of lawyers, and I will deploy every single one of them. Elena shook her head. Her eyes were red. And then what? He finds out I'm living in a crime lord's mansion? How do you think that plays in a custody hearing? Your Honor, the mother has moved her child into the home of a known criminal organization leader. Marcus's attorney will have a field day. The words landed. Lucien felt them the way he felt the glass cutting his palm. A sharp, precise pain in a place he didn't know was vulnerable. Because she was right. His protection, the very thing that made Elena and Rosie safe from the physical world, was the thing that could destroy them in a courtroom. His name, his reputation, his empire. Everything he'd built was a weapon that Marcus Kane could use against the woman Lucien was trying to protect. The irony was so perfect it was almost elegant. I won't let him take her, Lucien said. His voice was quiet, but something had changed in it. Something had stripped away the composure, the control, the measured precision. What remained was raw, closer to the surface, the voice of a man confronting a problem he couldn't solve with the tools that had worked for everything else. Elena looked at him. She reached out and touched his wounded hand. The cut from the glass, still unwrapped, still slowly bleeding. You need stitches, she said. I need to make a phone call. Lucien, stitches first. He looked at her hand on his, then at her face. Then he nodded, once, and let her lead him to the bathroom, where she cleaned the wound and closed it with butterfly strips from a first aid kit, her nursing training surfacing through years of disuse like muscle memory, her fingers steady and precise, even though the rest of her was shaking. When she finished, Lucien made his phone call, then 12 more. By midnight, a legal team of 4 attorneys specializing in family law had been retained. By morning, a private investigator was running a complete background on Marcus Kane. Financial records, criminal history, known associates, travel patterns, everything that lived in the digital shadow of a man's life. The results came back 48 hours later, and they changed everything. Lucien was in his study with Elena when Dominic brought the file. A thick manila folder stuffed with printouts, photographs, financial statements, and a document that Dominic set on top of the stack with the deliberate care of someone handling an explosive. You need to see this, Dominic said. His face was different than usual. The perpetual smile was gone. What remained was something grim and focused, and, for the first time since Elena had known him, genuinely concerned. Lucien opened the folder. He read. His eyes moved across the pages with mechanical precision, absorbing data the way machines absorb fuel. Elena watched his face for reaction and found nothing. Just that terrifying stillness, that compressed silence that preceded his worst decisions. Then he stopped reading. He set the document down. He placed both hands flat on the desk and stared at the surface between them as though he could see through it to something below. Lucien? Elena said. What is it? He didn't answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was stripped to its foundations. No texture, no warmth, no inflection. Just words laid end to end like bricks. Marcus Kane isn't acting alone. He's being funded and directed by Victor Draven. The name meant nothing to Elena, but she watched Dominic's face go white, watched the color drain from it the way water drains from a broken glass. And she understood that this name belonged to the kind of person who made even men like Dominic afraid. Who is Victor Draven? She asked. My competition, Lucien said. The word competition came out flat, clinical, as though he were describing a rival business rather than what Elena would soon understand was the only man in the city who had the resources, the cruelty, and the patience to threaten Lucien's empire. Dominic pulled out a photograph and slid it across the desk. Marcus Kane standing outside a restaurant with a tall, silver-haired man in a gray overcoat. The photograph was time-stamped 3 weeks ago, a week before Marcus showed up at the estate. They've been meeting regularly, Dominic said, at least 6 times in the past 2 months. Draven's been bankrolling Kane's legal fees. The attorney Marcus hired, he's on Draven's payroll. The whole custody play isn't about the kid. It's about you. He looked at Lucien. Draven wants to use Elena as leverage. If he can tie you up in a public custody battle, your name gets dragged into family court. Financial records get subpoenaed. Your assets, your properties, your business operations, all of it becomes discoverable. And once it's discoverable, it's prosecutable. Elena felt the room tilt. She gripped the arm of her chair. He's using Rosie, she said. Her voice was barely audible. He's using my daughter to get to Lucien. He's using all of you, Dominic said. Marcus doesn't want custody. He doesn't care about Rosie. He probably can't even remember her birthday. He wants the court proceeding itself. The subpoena power, the financial disclosure requirements, the public record. Draven gets a legal battering ram aimed at Lucien's empire, and Marcus gets paid for swinging it. Elena's stomach heaved. She pressed her hand flat against her abdomen and breathed through her nose and told herself she would not throw up in this room. She would not give this moment the satisfaction of reducing her to her body's weakest responses. There's more, Dominic said. He wasn't looking at Elena. He was looking at Lucien with an expression she couldn't read. Something between loyalty and accusation, between concern and confrontation. Say it, Lucien said. The background check on Kane turned up a secondary set of financial records. Offshore. routed through 3 shell companies. Kane has been receiving wire transfers from Draven's network for the past 6 months. The transfers started before Elena came to work here. Silence. A specific kind of silence. The kind that occurs when the air in a room is suddenly insufficient for the number of lungs trying to breathe it. Before, Elena repeated. Dominic nodded slowly. Before you were hired. Before you set foot in this house. The cleaning agency that sent you here? It's a front company. Registered to a holding group that traces back to one of Draven's shell operations. Elena's vision narrowed. The edges of the room went dark. She could hear her own heartbeat, could feel it pounding in her ears, in her wrists, in the hollow of her throat. You're saying I was sent here, she whispered. I'm saying someone arranged for you to be placed in this house, Dominic said carefully. Whether you knew it or not. The words detonated. Elena turned to Lucien. His face hadn't changed, not a single muscle had moved, but his eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes that she had learned to trust over the past weeks, that she had allowed herself to feel safe looking into, were locked on hers with an expression that made her blood crystallize. Doubt. For the first time since she'd known him, Lucien Moretti was looking at her with doubt. Lucien, she said. Her voice cracked. I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know. He didn't respond. He sat behind his desk with his hands flat on the surface and looked at her, and the silence between them became something physical, something with mass and edges, something that pressed against her chest until she couldn't breathe. Lucien, please, you have to believe me. Do I? The words were quiet. Not hostile. Worse. Clinical. The voice of a man who had survived by trusting evidence over emotion, by treating every relationship as a potential threat, by assuming that everything beautiful was also a weapon until proven otherwise. Marcus abandoned me. I had nothing. I was desperate. The agency called and offered work, and I took it because I had no other choice. I didn't know who owned it. I didn't know where they were sending me. I didn't know anything. And Marcus showing up 3 weeks later? I had no idea he was coming. You saw my face when he walked in. You saw me. I was terrified. Or performing. The word hit her like an open hand. Elena flinched, physically flinched, the same flinch she'd shown the first time Lucien touched her scar. The involuntary full-body recoil of a woman who'd been struck so many times that her muscles had memorized the shape of it. Lucien saw the flinch. Something shifted in his face, a crack in the suspicion, a fracture line of something that might have been regret. But he didn't take the word back. He couldn't. Because the alternative to suspicion was vulnerability, and vulnerability in his world was the thing that killed you. Dominic stood by the door watching both of them. His face was unreadable. I'll give you 2 a minute, he said, and left. The door clicked shut. Elena and Lucien sat in silence. She could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, could hear the distant sound of Rosie's laughter somewhere in the house. Pure, unburdened, the laughter of a child who didn't know that the ground beneath her life had just split open. Everything I told you was true, Elena said. Her voice was steady now. Not strong. Strength had nothing to do with it. Steady because she had reached the bottom of something and there was nothing left below her to fall toward. Every word, the burns, Marcus, the fear, the years of nothing. I didn't know about the agency. I didn't know about Draven. I didn't know about any of it. And if you can't believe that, then there's nothing I can do, because I have given you everything I have, and if everything isn't enough, then I have nothing left to offer. Mom. Lucien looked at her for a very long time. His breathing was controlled. His posture was rigid. His hands were still flat on the desk, pressed so hard the knuckles had gone white. Then he stood up. He walked around the desk. He stopped in front of her, and he crouched down until they were eye level. This massive, terrifying man folding himself into a position of vulnerability in front of a woman who had no power, no leverage, no weapons except the raw, unprotected truth of her own pain. He reached out and took her face in both hands. The wounded hand. The unwounded hand. His palms against her cheeks, his fingers in her hair, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that felt like surgery, cutting through skin and muscle and bone to find the thing buried deepest. If you are lying to me, he said quietly, I will find out, and it will destroy me. Not because of what it cost my empire, because of what it cost my ability to believe that anything in this world is real. Elena held his gaze. A tear escaped down her cheek and ran into the crease of his palm. I'm not lying to you, she whispered. Lucien closed his eyes. His forehead dropped against hers. She could feel his breath on her lips, could feel the tremor running through his hands. Not fear, not weakness, but the enormous, exhausting effort of a man choosing to trust when every lesson of his life had taught him that trust was the knife people used when they wanted to cut you somewhere that didn't show. Then we fight, he said, together, and whatever comes, we face it standing. He stood up. He pulled her to her feet. He held her against his chest, and she pressed her face into the hollow of his neck and breathed him in. Whiskey and cedar and something metallic underneath. The permanent smell of a man who lived closer to violence than anyone should. And for 30 seconds, standing in that study, held by arms strong enough to break and gentle enough not to, Elena felt safe. Then Lucien's phone rang. He answered it, listened. His body went rigid against hers, every muscle locking simultaneously, a full system response to whatever was coming through the receiver. When? He said. A pause. How many? Another pause. Lock everything down. Every gate. Every entrance. Nobody in or out. He hung up. Elena pulled back and looked at his face, and what she saw there made her stomach drop through the floor. Lucien's composure was gone. Not cracked. Not fractured. Gone. What remained was something primal, something older than language. The raw biological expression of a predator that has just been told its den has been breached. What happened? Elena whispered. Someone took photographs of Rosie at the garden this afternoon, from outside the wall. Long-range lens. The images were delivered to Draven's office an hour ago with a note. What note? Lucien's jaw clenched so hard she could hear his teeth creak. She looks just like her mother. Same eyes, same fear. How long before she has the same scars? The sound that came out of Elena wasn't a scream. It was something beneath screaming. A low animal sound from the deepest part of her diaphragm, the sound a mother makes when the threat reaches her child. When every abstract fear she's been carrying becomes concrete and specific and aimed at the thing she would die to protect. She turned and ran. Down the hallway, through the foyer, toward the kitchen where Rosie was sitting on a stool eating animal crackers and telling Agatha about Gerald's latest adventure in monster fighting. Elena swept her daughter off the stool and held her so tight Rosie squeaked in protest, her small body compressed against Elena's chest, her confused face pressed into her mother's neck. Mama, you're squishing me. I know, baby, I know. I'm sorry. Mama, why are you crying? Elena couldn't answer. She stood in the kitchen holding her daughter and felt the world narrow to the exact circumference of her arms, to the warm, breathing weight of this child who smelled like cookies and lavender shampoo. This child who didn't know that somewhere beyond the walls of this house, men were using her existence as a weapon. Lucien appeared in the doorway. Behind him, the house was transforming. Men moved through hallways with purpose and urgency. Doors locked, shutters closed. The quiet, elegant mansion was becoming what it had always been beneath the surface. A fortress. Lucien looked at Elena holding Rosie. He looked at the fear on her face, the tears on her cheeks, the white-knuckled grip of her arms around the child's body. And something in Lucien Moretti finished changing. The man who had spent decades calibrating his violence, measuring his responses, calculating the precise amount of force required for each situation. That man stepped back, and what stepped forward was something older, something that existed before strategy and discipline and control. He pulled out his phone, dialed a number, waited. Gather everyone, he said. Every captain, every lieutenant, every man we have, full mobilization, tonight. He paused. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a register Elena had never heard before. Something subterranean, something that vibrated at a frequency designed to be felt in the bones rather than heard in the ears. Victor Draven just threatened my family. I want his world to end. I want it to end loudly, and I want him to know exactly who is doing it and exactly why. He hung up. He looked at Elena. Take Rosie to the safe room in the basement. Agatha will show you. Don't come out until I come for you personally. Lucien, what are you going to do? He walked to her. He kissed Rosie's head, softly, barely a brush of his lips against the child's dark curls. Then he kissed Elena. Not softly. Hard, desperate, thorough, the kiss of a man who was about to walk through a door he might not walk back through. "Whatever it takes," he said. And he walked out of the kitchen and into the gathering dark, and Elena stood holding her daughter in a house that was locking itself around her like a fist, listening to the sound of engines starting outside, of men moving with lethal purpose through the night, of a war beginning its first breath. She carried Rosie down to the basement. The safe room was concrete and steel, stocked with water and blankets and a small television playing cartoons, as though the world above weren't unraveling. She sat on the floor with her daughter in her lap and Gerald the elephant clutched between them. Rosie fell asleep within minutes. Children are miraculous that way, able to find unconsciousness in the middle of catastrophe, trusting that the arms holding them are enough. Elena didn't sleep. She sat in the concrete room beneath a mansion at war and listened to the muffled sounds of the city above, distant sirens, distant engines, the occasional low rumble that might have been thunder or might have been something far worse, and waited for the man she loved to come back alive. And somewhere in the space between breathing and praying, Elena Vale stopped being the woman who survived by running. She became the woman who would stay and fight for everything she had left, even if fighting meant standing beside a monster, even if fighting meant becoming something she never imagined, even if fighting meant burning down every version of herself she'd ever been, and building something new from the ashes, something harder, something fiercer, something worthy of the war that had finally, irreversibly, found her. The first explosion hit the harbor at 11:47 p.m. Elena felt it before she heard it, a deep, subsonic shudder that traveled through the concrete floor of the safe room and up through her spine like a second heartbeat. The overhead light swayed. Dust drifted from a ceiling crack she hadn't noticed before. On the small television, the cartoon kept playing, its bright colors and cheerful music grotesquely indifferent to whatever was happening above. Rosie stirred against her chest but didn't wake. Gerald the elephant was wedged between them, one chewed ear poking out from beneath the blanket Elena had wrapped around her daughter's shoulders. A second shudder, deeper this time, longer. The kind of vibration that enters through the floor and doesn't fully leave the body, that settles in the teeth and the joints and the soft tissue behind the eyes. Elena pressed her back against the concrete wall and counted her breaths. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. A technique from nursing school designed for panic attacks, for the moment when the sympathetic nervous system floods the bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline and the brain starts making decisions based on fear instead of logic. She had been in this room for 3 hours. Nobody had come. Nobody had called. The steel door had no window, no intercom, no connection to the world above except the muffled sounds that reached her through layers of concrete and steel. Sounds that could have been anything, could have meant anything, could have been the last sounds of the life she'd built inside these walls. She didn't know if Lucien was alive. The thought sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't swallow and couldn't spit out. She held it there, sharp-edged and enormous, and breathed around it. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Somewhere above her, the city was burning. Lucien had moved through the first 3 hours of the war with the cold, mechanical precision of a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Not this specific moment, not Victor Draven, not Marcus Kane, not Elena and Rosie cowering in a basement, but this category of moment. The category where everything converges, where the comfortable distance between threat and action collapses to zero, where the only remaining question is how much of the world you're willing to destroy to protect the small, fragile thing you love. He had answered that question before midnight. The answer was all of it. The harbor warehouses went first. 3 buildings along the waterfront that Draven used to launder cash through import-export fronts, moving dirty money through shipping manifests, inflating the value of cargo containers that held nothing but air and false paperwork. Lucien's men hit them simultaneously. Not with fire. Fire was imprecise, theatrical, the weapon of amateurs who wanted to make a statement. Lucien used information. Federal tip lines received anonymous packages containing financial records, shipping logs, customs declarations, and bank routing numbers. Every document authenticated, every number verified, every trail leading directly to Draven's network. By 1 a.m., FBI field agents were executing search warrants on 3 Draven-linked properties in the warehouse district. By 2 a.m., 2 of Draven's financial officers were in federal custody, their lawyers scrambling to make phone calls that nobody on the other end wanted to answer. Lucien watched the operation unfold from the back seat of a black SUV parked on a side street 6 blocks from the harbor. Dominic sat beside him, phone pressed to his ear, relaying updates from captains positioned across the city. Warehouse 3 is secured. Feds are inside. Carlucci's team confirmed the evidence packages were received and opened. Lucien nodded. His face was illuminated by the blue glow of a phone screen showing a map of the city with positions marked in red and green. Red for Draven's assets, green for Lucien's people. The map looked like a chessboard mid-game, pieces scattered in patterns that only made sense to the player who'd arranged them. The money laundering network? Lucien asked. Collapsed. 3 of his 4 main channels are frozen. The 4th is being monitored. We let it run so the feds can trace it upstream. His captains? Scattering. Palazzo flipped an hour ago. He's been feeding us Draven's logistics in exchange for protection. Munoz went dark, probably running. The Kessler brothers are holding position at the Riverside Club, but they're isolated. No reinforcements coming. Lucien processed this without expression. His eyes moved across the map, calculating positions, anticipating responses, running scenarios in a mind that had been trained since childhood to treat conflict as mathematics. Variables, probabilities, acceptable losses. And Draven himself? Dominic lowered his phone. The pause before he answered was a fraction too long, and Lucien noticed it the way he noticed everything. Completely, instantly, with the full weight of his attention. We don't have him, Dominic said. He left his penthouse at 10 p.m., convoy of 3 vehicles. They split up at the interchange. We tracked 2 of them. Both were decoys. Where did the 3rd go? North. After that, we lost it. Lucien's jaw tightened. A single muscle flexed beneath his ear. The involuntary response of a man whose control was being tested by an enemy, smart enough to remain invisible at the moment Lucien most needed him visible. Find him, Lucien said. We're working on... Find him, Dominic, tonight. I don't care what it costs. Dominic held his gaze for a beat. Then he lifted the phone and started making calls. The SUV pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the wet, glittering dark of the city at war. Across town, in a rented office above a dry cleaning shop on West Addison, Marcus Kane sat in a plastic chair and tried to stop his hands from shaking. The office was small, windowless, lit by a single fluorescent tube that buzzed and flickered with a frequency that made his teeth ache. A folding table held a laptop, a prepaid phone, and a half-empty bottle of bourbon that Marcus had been working through since the first explosion echoed across the harbor. He was alone. The bodyguard Draven had provided, a thick, silent man named Gregor, had left 2 hours ago to check the perimeter and hadn't come back. The prepaid phone hadn't rung. The laptop showed news feeds describing suspected arson at the harbor and ongoing federal investigations at multiple properties in the warehouse district. And every headline felt like a fist closing around Marcus's throat. This was not what he'd signed up for. The deal had been simple, elegant even. Draven had found Marcus 6 months ago, tracked him down in a bar in Cincinnati where he'd been living under a name that wasn't his, spending money he'd stolen from an ex-girlfriend's checking account, drinking himself toward a finish line he couldn't see but was accelerating toward nonetheless. Draven had sat across from him in a booth and laid it out like a business proposal. Go back to the city, file for custody of the child, force Lucien Moretti into a legal battle that would crack open his empire like an egg. In exchange, Marcus would receive $200,000 and new identification documents good enough to start over anywhere in the world. Marcus hadn't hesitated, not because he was brave, because Marcus Kane had never been brave, not once in his miserable life, but because he was desperate, and desperation looks exactly like courage if you don't examine it too closely. But now the harbor was on fire, and Draven's people were scattering, and the thick bodyguard was gone, and Marcus was alone in a room that smelled like dry cleaning chemicals. And the courage that was really desperation was rapidly becoming what it had always been underneath. Fear. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. Building is compromised. Move to secondary location. Parking structure on West Belmont. Level 3. Gray van. You have 20 minutes. Marcus stared at the message. His hands were shaking badly enough now that the phone trembled visibly, the screen light bouncing off his face in jittering patterns. 20 minutes. He grabbed the bourbon, took a long pull, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Then he stood up, put on his jacket, and opened the office door. The hallway was dark. The dry cleaning shop below was closed, its machines silent, the chemical smell rising through the floorboards in thick, invisible waves. Marcus walked to the stairwell, descended to the ground floor, and pushed through the back exit into an alley that stank of garbage and rain-soaked concrete. He made it 4 steps before a hand closed around his collar and slammed him face first into the brick wall. The impact was blinding. His nose cracked, not broke, but the cartilage compressed with a wet grinding sound that sent white light shooting through his vision. Blood poured immediately, hot and copper-tasting, flooding his upper lip and chin. He tried to turn, tried to swing, tried to do anything except hang against the wall like a coat on a hook, but the hand on his collar was immovable, a mechanical, inhuman grip that treated his body weight as an afterthought. Marcus Kane, the voice came from behind him. Not Lucien's, deeper, rougher, a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed. I have a message from Mr. Moretti. Marcus's bladder released. He felt the warmth spread down his leg and the shame hit simultaneously with the terror, the two emotions braiding together into something that made his vision tunnel and his knees buckle. Please, he gasped. The word came out wet, distorted by blood and the pressure of his face against brick. Please, I'll give you whatever. I'll tell you everything. Draven, it was Draven's idea, all of it. I didn't have a choice. The message is simple. The hand turned him around. Marcus found himself staring up at a man he'd never seen before. Enormous, broad, with a face that contained no expression at all, just flat operational blankness. The face of someone who performed violence the way accountants performed audits. Mr. Moretti wants you to understand that there is nowhere on this earth you can go where he will not find you. There is no name you can hide behind. There is no country far enough, no hole deep enough, no shadow dark enough. You touched his family, and for that you will answer, not tonight, not tomorrow, but soon. And when the time comes, you will not see it coming. You will simply stop existing. Marcus was sobbing now, full, ugly, body-racking sobs that shook his chest and sprayed blood from his broken nose in fine pink mist. But tonight, the man continued with absolute calm, Mr. Moretti wants something else from you first. He released Marcus's collar. Marcus slid down the wall until he was sitting in the wet alley with his back against brick and his ruined face tilted toward the sky. The man reached into his jacket and produced a phone. Not Marcus's phone. A new one. Clean. He held it out. You're going to call Victor Draven. You're going to tell him you're scared and you want out. You're going to ask him to come get you personally. You're going to give him this address. And you're going to be very, very convincing. Marcus stared at the phone through tears and blood and the blurred, fractured remains of his vision. And if I don't? The man crouched down. He was so close Marcus could smell him, gun oil and mint and laundry detergent, the mundane domestic smells of a man who washed his clothes and cleaned his weapons with equal regularity. Then the message I just delivered stops being a message, the man said quietly, and becomes a demonstration. Marcus took the phone. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it. Blood dripped from his chin onto the screen. He wiped it with his sleeve, smearing red across the glass, and dialed the number he'd been given 6 months ago in a Cincinnati bar by a silver-haired man who'd promised him money and a new life and hadn't once mentioned, that the price of both was standing in the crosshairs of Lucien Moretti. The line rang 3 times. Marcus. Draven's voice was smooth, unhurried, the voice of a man watching a storm from behind bulletproof glass. I trust you received the relocation instructions. Victor. Marcus's voice was a ruin, cracked, nasal, thick with blood and terror. Victor, I need you. They found me. Moretti's people, they were here. They were in the building. I barely got out. I'm at the alley behind the dry cleaner on Addison. Please, you have to come get me. Please. The performance wasn't difficult. He didn't have to fake the fear. He didn't have to manufacture the desperation. Every cracking syllable was authentic. Every trembling breath was real, and the tears running through the blood on his face were the most honest thing Marcus Kane had produced in years. Silence on the line. Marcus could hear Draven thinking, that calculating, predatory silence that men like Draven and Lucien shared, the silence of minds that treated every human interaction as a chess move. "Are you injured?" Draven asked. "My nose, my face. Victor, please. I can't stay here. They said they're coming back." Another silence, longer this time. "Stay where you are," Draven said. "I'll send someone." No, don't send someone. Come yourself. Victor, I know things about Moretti's operation, things I overheard at the estate, things that could end him, but I'll only tell you, face to face. I don't trust phones. I don't trust your people. I trust you. Come yourself. It was clumsy. Marcus knew it was clumsy. The words were too desperate, too specific, the kind of bait that a careful man would recognize and refuse. But Marcus was gambling on something he'd learned about Victor Draven in 6 months of working for him. The man's arrogance was bigger than his caution. Draven believed he was smarter than everyone in every room. He believed that his ability to anticipate and manipulate made him untouchable. And the idea that Marcus, pathetic, broken, bleeding Marcus, might possess information capable of destroying Lucien Moretti would be irresistible to a man whose entire identity was built on the conviction that he was destined to win. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. 15. "I'll be there in 40 minutes, Draven said. "Don't move." The line went dead. Marcus lowered the phone. His hand dropped to his side. He sat in the alley and bled and waited and tried not to think about what was going to happen when Victor Draven walked into a trap set by Lucien Moretti. The large man took the phone from Marcus's limp hand, checked the screen, and spoke into an earpiece. "He's coming. 40 minutes. West Addison." Then he looked down at Marcus with an expression that might have been pity in a man capable of the emotion. "For what it's worth," he said, "you did good." Ooh. Marcus didn't respond. He sat in the wet alley with blood drying on his face and urine cooling against his leg and stared at nothing and felt, for the first time with absolute clarity, the full weight of every choice he'd ever made. Every burned cigarette against Elena's skin, every slammed door, every screamed accusation, every moment he'd chosen cruelty because kindness required a courage he didn't possess, and understood that the bill for all of it was coming due tonight, and that the currency would be everything he had left. In the safe room beneath the Ashcroft estate, Elena's phone rang. She grabbed it so fast she nearly dropped it. The screen showed Lucien's name. She answered before the second ring completed. "Lucien, it's me." 2 words. But the sound of his voice, alive, present, real, hit her so hard her vision blurred. She pressed the phone against her ear and closed her eyes and breathed. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No." "Is it over?" A pause. Brief. But she heard everything inside it. The exhaustion, the controlled violence, the weight of decisions made in rooms she would never see. "Almost," he said. "Draven is coming to us. Tonight. Within the hour." Elena opened her eyes. Rosie was still asleep, curled on the floor mat, with Gerald pressed against her face, her breathing slow and even, completely untouched by the catastrophe unfolding in layers above her. "What happens when he gets there?" Elena asked. "I handle it." "Lucien, what does that mean?" Silence. She could hear him breathing, could hear the faint sounds of movement around him. Engines, voices, the efficient choreography of men preparing for something final. "It means that by morning, Victor Draven will no longer be a factor in our lives, in anyone's lives." Elena's grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles ached. She understood what he was saying. She understood it completely, with a clarity that should have horrified her, that would have horrified the version of herself that existed before Marcus and the burns, and the years of running, and the 3 hours alone in a concrete room wondering if the man she loved was dead. That version of herself was gone. "Come home after," she said. "Whatever happens, whatever it costs. Come home." "I will. Promise me." "Elena, promise me, Lucien." Another silence, then so quietly she almost missed it. "I promise." The line went dead. Elena lowered the phone to her lap and sat in the harsh fluorescent light of the safe room and waited. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She sat with her sleeping daughter and her daughter's chewed stuffed elephant, and she waited with the terrible granite patience of a woman who had decided that whatever came through the door next, salvation or destruction, the man she loved or the news that he was gone, she would meet it standing. 43 minutes later, a black sedan turned onto West Addison Street. Victor Draven sat in the back seat. He was 62 years old, silver-haired, lean, dressed in a gray overcoat that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His face was angular, composed, the face of a man who had cultivated an air of intellectual superiority for so long it had calcified into his bone structure. He looked like a university professor or a retired diplomat, the kind of man you'd trust instinctively and regret trusting permanently. He brought two men. Not enough. He knew it wasn't enough. But bringing more would have meant admitting he was afraid, and Victor Draven had built his identity on the absolute, unshakable conviction that he was never afraid, that fear was a biological error he'd corrected in himself decades ago through willpower and strategic thinking. This conviction was about to be tested. The sedan stopped at the mouth of the alley behind the dry cleaner. Draven's driver stayed in the car. The two bodyguards exited first, scanned the alley, found Marcus sitting against the wall in a posture of complete collapse, head bowed, face crusted with dried blood, body limp. "Clear," one of them said. Draven stepped out of the car. He adjusted his overcoat. He walked into the alley with measured steps, his shoes clicking against wet pavement, his face arranged in an expression of controlled concern that was as authentic as a counterfeit bill. "Marcus, you look terrible." Marcus raised his head. His eyes were swollen. His nose was a purple ruin, and he looked at Draven with an expression that Draven misread as gratitude, but was actually something much more complex: relief and guilt, and the hollow, weightless feeling of a man who has just handed another human being to the wolf. "Victor, thank you. Thank you for coming." Draven crouched beside him. Not out of compassion, Draven didn't crouch for anyone, but to bring his face level with Marcus's, to examine the damage, to assess whether this broken man still had value or had become a liability that needed to be eliminated. "You said you had information," Draven said, "about Moretti's operations." "I do. I overheard—" "Tell me." Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes shifted, involuntarily, helplessly, to a point somewhere behind Draven's left shoulder. Draven noticed. He was a man who noticed everything except the one thing that mattered most, the possibility that he had been outplayed. He turned. Lucien Moretti stood at the mouth of the alley. He was alone. No bodyguards flanking him, no weapon visible in his hands, just Lucien. Black suit, white shirt, scarred hands at his sides, his body filling the narrow alley entrance the way a cork fills a bottle. Behind him, the street was empty, unnaturally empty. No cars. No pedestrians. No sound except the distant hum of the city and the faint dripping of rain from gutters. Draven's bodyguards reached for their weapons simultaneously. They never completed the motion. From the darkness on both sides of the alley, from doorways and fire escapes and the shadowed recesses of the buildings that lined it, Lucien's men materialized like something coalescing from the night itself. 8 of them, armed, positioned with the geometric precision of a trap that had been set hours ago and was only now springing shut. The bodyguards froze. Their hands hovered at their hips, caught in the no man's land between drawing and surrendering, their eyes moving rapidly between the armed men emerging from the shadows. "Don't," Lucien said quietly. The word was directed at the bodyguards, and it carried the weight of absolute certainty. The certainty of a man who knew exactly how many weapons were pointed at how many bodies and had already calculated every possible outcome. The bodyguards lowered their hands. Draven straightened slowly. He turned to face Lucien fully, and to his credit, to the credit of a lifetime spent cultivating unshakable composure, his face betrayed nothing. Not fear, not surprise, just the flat, appraising expression of a chess player studying a board position he hadn't anticipated. "Lucien," he said. His voice was steady, almost conversational. "This is theatrical, even for you. You threatened my family. I conducted business. You photographed my child. You sent a note describing scars on a woman who earned those scars being tortured by a man you hired. You called that business. I called it leverage, which is what it was. And if you'd responded rationally, we could have negotiated. But you've always preferred spectacle to strategy. Lucien stepped into the alley. 1 step. 2. His footsteps echoed against the wet pavement, each one landing with a precision that felt rehearsed, inevitable. The footsteps of something that had been approaching Draven since the moment the first photograph of Rosie had been taken. You've miscalculated, Lucien said. Have I? You assume my attachment to Elena and Rosie was a vulnerability. Something to exploit. Something to use against me. Another step, closer. But you got the math wrong, Victor. You looked at them and saw a pressure point. I look at them and see the reason I no longer have any limit on what I'm willing to do. Draven's composure held, but something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker, a micro-adjustment, the first crack in a dam that had never been tested at full pressure. You're going to kill me, Draven said. Not a question. No. The answer surprised Draven visibly. The composure fractured another millimeter. No? Lucien stopped. He was close enough now that Draven could see the scar on his left hand, the butterfly strips on his right palm, the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. Close enough to see that Lucien Moretti was not a monster. He was a man, a tired, scarred, furious man who had spent the last 12 hours dismantling an empire while the woman he loved sat in a concrete room beneath his house, holding their daughter and waiting to find out if he would survive the night. Killing you would make you a martyr, Lucien said. Your people would regroup. Your money would scatter. Your allies would use your death as a rallying point. I'd spend the next 5 years fighting ghosts. He reached into his jacket. Draven's bodyguards tensed. Lucien's men adjusted their aim. The alley held its breath. Lucien pulled out a phone. He held it up so Draven could see the screen. Instead, Lucien said, I've taken everything. Your warehouses are in federal custody. Your financial officers are cooperating with prosecutors. Your laundering network is frozen. Your captains have either flipped or fled. Your attorney, the one representing Marcus, is currently being questioned by the FBI about his involvement in your operation. By morning, every asset you have will be seized, every account you own will be locked, and every ally you've cultivated will deny ever having met you. Draven's face changed. The composure didn't just crack, it fell. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in a slow, terrible subsidence like watching a building settle into its own foundation. The walls still standing, but the structure underneath gone, hollowed out, reduced to nothing. You're a dead man walking, Victor, Lucien continued. Not because I killed you, because the system you've been bribing and manipulating for 30 years just received enough evidence to bury you for the rest of your natural life. And every piece of that evidence came from inside your own operation, from your own people, from the men you trusted because you were so convinced of your own superiority that it never occurred to you they might have a price. Draven stared at the phone screen. His face in the fluorescent glow of the device looked old suddenly, ancient, eroded, the face of a man watching his entire life's work dissolve in real time. You had my people, Draven whispered. I've had your people for 2 years, waiting, patient, collecting everything. You forced my hand tonight, Victor. I would have preferred to do this quietly, surgically. But you threatened a 3-year-old girl, and I find that my patience for surgical precision disappears entirely when someone aims a camera at my daughter. The alley was silent. Rain dripped from gutters. Somewhere distant, a siren wailed and faded. Draven looked at Lucien, and for the first time in a long, long career built on the illusion of invincibility, Victor Draven understood what it felt like to be completely, irrevocably, terminally defeated. Not by violence, not by a bullet, but by a man who had been smarter, more patient, and more ruthless in every way that mattered. And Marcus? Draven asked. His voice was hollow. Lucien glanced down at Marcus, still slumped against the wall, still bleeding, still staring at the ground with the vacant expression of a man whose soul had left his body several hours ago and hadn't bothered to come back. Marcus is going to disappear, Lucien said. Voluntarily, permanently. He's going to sign away every legal claim to his daughter. He's going to destroy every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence connecting him to Elena or Rosie. and then he's going to leave this city and never return. He looked at Marcus. Aren't you Marcus? Marcus nodded, a small, broken movement. The nod of a man who had run out of options the way a car runs out of gas, completely, mechanically, with no drama and no appeal. Lucien turned back to Draven. He stepped close enough that his voice dropped to something only Draven could hear, something private, final, meant for one set of ears and no others. If you ever speak Elena's name again, Lucien whispered, if you ever look at a photograph of my daughter again, if you ever so much as think about my family in the quiet hours of whatever cell you end up rotting in, I will know, and I will come for you. Not with evidence, not with strategy, with my hands. And what I do to you will make everything that happened tonight look like a courtesy. He stepped back. Get him out of my city, he said to his men. And then Lucien Moretti turned his back on Victor Draven, an act of contempt so complete, so absolute, that it landed harder than any bullet, and walked out of the alley, past his men, past the empty street, toward the black SUV waiting at the curb. He climbed into the back seat. Dominic was already inside, phone in hand, eyes bloodshot from a night of coordinated warfare. It's done? Dominic asked. Lucien leaned his head back against the seat. He closed his eyes. The exhaustion hit all at once. A wave so enormous it seemed to crush the air from his lungs, pressing him into the leather like a physical weight. His hand throbbed where the glass had cut it. His neck ached from hours of tension held so tightly his muscles had forgotten how to release. His eyes burned behind closed lids. Take me home, he said. The SUV pulled away from the curb and headed toward the Ashcroft estate, and Lucien Moretti sat in the back seat with his eyes closed and his bleeding hand resting on his knee, and felt, for the first time in 12 hours, the coiled wire inside his chest begin to loosen. Not fully, not yet. Not until he could walk through the basement door and see Elena's face and hear Rosie breathing, but enough. Enough to let him exhale, enough to let the machinery slow down, enough to remind him that somewhere beneath the monster the city feared, the man Elena loved was still alive, still breathing, still capable of walking through a door and falling to his knees in front of the woman who had become the only thing in his entire violent, merciless, blood-soaked life that he was not willing to lose. The SUV turned onto the private road that led to the estate. The gates opened, and Lucien went home. The steel door opened at 4:17 a.m. Elena heard it before she saw it. The heavy mechanical groan of the lock disengaging, the pneumatic hiss of the seal releasing, sounds she had been waiting for through 3 hours and 42 minutes of concrete silence and fluorescent light, and the steady, sleeping breath of her daughter against her chest. She was on her feet before the door finished swinging open. Lucien stood in the doorway. He filled it the way he filled every space, completely, inevitably, with a density that went beyond physical mass into something heavier, something gravitational. His suit was wrinkled. His white shirt was untucked on one side. The handkerchief around his right hand had soaked through with blood that had dried into a stiff brown crust. His face was gray with exhaustion, not pale, not drawn, but gray, the color of a man who had burned through every reserve his body possessed and was now operating on something deeper than adrenaline, something that ran on will alone. His eyes found Elena, and the architecture collapsed, not partially, not in the controlled, fractional way she'd seen before. The hairline cracks, the microfissures, the momentary lapses that he sealed over with practiced speed. This was total, structural. The entire edifice of control and composure and cold precision that Lucien Moretti had spent 36 years building came down in the space between one heartbeat and the next, and what stood in its ruins was a man so exhausted and so relieved that his body forgot how to hold itself upright. His hand caught the doorframe. His knees buckled. Not all the way, not to the ground, not quite, but enough that Elena saw the tremor run through his legs, saw the muscles in his arm lock as he braced himself against the steel frame, saw his chest expand with a breath that shuddered on the way in and didn't fully release on the way out. Elena crossed the distance between them in 3 steps. She caught his face in both hands. His skin was cold. His jaw was rough with stubble. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites mapped with burst capillaries from hours of sustained tension. "I'm here," she said. Lucien's wounded hand came up and covered hers. The dried blood on the bandage scraped against her fingers. "It's over," he said. 2 words. The same 2 words he'd whispered on the phone hours ago. But this time she could see his face when he said them, could see the cost written in every line in shadow, could see that over didn't mean finished so much as survived. The way a soldier says a battle is over. Not with triumph, but with the hollow, gutted relief of someone who made it to the other side and is only now beginning to calculate what they lost in the crossing. Elena pulled his head down until his forehead rested against hers. They stood in the doorway of the safe room, this concrete box designed to withstand bombs and sieges and the worst that violent men could deliver, and breathed together. In and out. In and out. The simple, stupid, miraculous act of 2 sets of lungs filling and emptying in the same small space. Behind Elena, Rosie stirred on the floor mat. A small sound. The rustle of a blanket. Then a sleep-thickened voice. "Mama?" Elena turned. Rosie was sitting up. Gerald, the elephant, clutched against her chest. Her dark curls flattened on one side from sleeping. She blinked at the light from the open doorway, squinting. Then she saw Lucien. "Lucien," she said. The name she'd invented for him because Lucien contained sounds her 3-year-old mouth couldn't quite arrange. She said it the way she said everything, with complete confidence and zero hesitation, as though the man standing in the doorway with blood on his hands and murder still fading from his eyes was simply another fixture of her world, as reliable and unremarkable as the garden fountain or the kitchen stool where she ate her cookies. "Lucien, you look tired." Lucien exhaled. The sound was raw, involuntary, torn from somewhere deep in his chest. He crouched down, slowly, stiffly, his body protesting every inch of the descent, until he was level with the child. "I am tired," he said. "Did the monsters come?" A pause. Lucien looked at Elena. Elena looked back at him. The conversation they had in that glance lasted a lifetime and covered everything. Every decision, every act, every line crossed, and every cost paid. And at the end of it, Lucien turned back to Rosie. "They came," he said, "but Gerald scared them away." Rosie looked at her elephant with renewed admiration. "I told you he was brave." "You did. You were right. Can we go upstairs now? This room is boring." Lucien almost smiled. Not quite. The muscles around his mouth moved in the direction of a smile, but the exhaustion intercepted it halfway, converting it into something gentler and sadder. The expression of a man who had just spent 12 hours ensuring that this child could wake up safe, could complain about boredom, could hold her stuffed elephant and talk about monsters with the casual fearlessness that only comes from being thoroughly, absolutely protected. "Yeah," he said, "we can go upstairs." He stood up. Rosie raised her arms, the universal toddler gesture for pick me up. An act of trust so automatic and complete that it contained no thought whatsoever. Just the bone-deep certainty that the arms reaching for her would catch her and hold her and carry her somewhere warm. Lucien picked her up. She weighed nothing. She weighed everything. She settled against his chest with Gerald wedged between them, and her head dropping immediately to his shoulder, her body going boneless with the instant, total relaxation of a child who has found the safest place available and intends to exploit it fully. Elena watched Lucien carry her daughter up the stairs. She watched the way his scarred hand cupped the back of Rosie's head, fingers spread wide, covering the child's skull the way you'd cover something made of glass. She watched the way he adjusted his stride to minimize the rocking motion, keeping Rosie's weight balanced, his exhausted body finding reserves of gentleness that should have been impossible after the night he'd just survived. And she understood in that moment, with a clarity that was almost painful in its precision, that the distance between monster and protector was not a spectrum. It was not a sliding scale. It was a choice, made fresh every single hour of every single day, and Lucien Moretti had spent every hour of this night making it. They emerged from the basement into a house that was already changing. The shutters were opening. Light, gray, pre-dawn, the uncertain light of a city that had spent the night holding its breath, filtered through windows that had been sealed for hours. Security men moved through the corridors with a different energy now, the wound-tight alertness of combat giving way to the methodical calm of aftermath. Weapons were being holstered, phones were being lowered. Somewhere in the kitchen, someone had started making coffee. and the smell drifted through the foyer like a signal that the world was resuming its ordinary rhythms. Agatha appeared at the top of the main staircase. She looked at Lucien carrying Rosie. She looked at Elena walking beside him with her hand resting on his arm. She looked at the blood on his hand and the exhaustion on his face and the sleeping child curled against his chest. Her expression didn't change. Agatha's expression never changed, but she reached out as they passed and briefly, so briefly, it could have been accidental, touched Elena's shoulder. "I'll have breakfast ready in an hour," she said. "Thank you, Agatha." "There's gauze and antiseptic in the upstairs bathroom. His hand needs proper treatment." "I know." Agatha watched them walk down the hallway toward the east wing, and for a moment, just a moment, something crossed her face that might have been the first genuine emotion Elena had ever seen from her. Not warmth exactly. Something harder than warmth. Recognition. The look of a woman who had spent decades in a house full of violent men and had learned to distinguish between the ones who destroyed and the ones who protected, and had just watched the distinction become unmistakable. Elena put Rosie to bed. The child was asleep before her head touched the pillow. Gerald tucked under one arm, her mouth slightly open, her breathing slow and deep and perfectly even. Elena stood over the bed for a long time, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall, counting the breaths the way she'd counted them in the hospital after Rosie was born. Not because she needed to, but because the act of counting was proof. Proof that the child was alive. Proof that the night was over. Proof that whatever else had been lost or broken or permanently altered, this was still here. This was still real. She found Lucien in the bathroom. He was standing at the sink, his ruined hand under running water. The butterfly strips Elena had applied hours ago peeling away in the stream, the cut reopened and bleeding sluggishly. His jacket was off. His shirt was open at the collar. He was staring at his own face in the mirror with an expression she recognized. The expression of someone trying to reconcile the person they were before tonight with the person they'd become during it. "Sit down," Elena said. He sat on the edge of the bathtub. She knelt on the tile floor in front of him and opened the first aid kit and began cleaning the wound properly this time, irrigating it, debriding the edges, closing it with fresh strips spaced evenly along the cut. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was calm. The nursing training that had been dormant for years was fully awake now, her fingers moving with the kind of practiced, automatic competence that comes from having once done this every day. Lucien watched her work. His eyes tracked her hands with the exhausted focus of a man who wanted to be present for this moment, but was fighting his body's desperate need to shut down. "Draven is finished," he said quietly. "The feds have enough to put him away for decades. His organization is dismantled. His money is frozen. His people are either cooperating or running. And Marcus?" Lucien's jaw tightened. The muscle beneath his ear flexed. Marcus signed the documents. "Full relinquishment of parental rights. Voluntary. Witnessed. Notarized by my attorney at 3 a.m. in the back of an SUV. He'll be on a plane within 6 hours. Where he goes after that is not my concern, as long as where he goes is far from here." Elena placed the last butterfly strip. She held his hand between both of hers and looked at the wound. Sealed now. Clean. Beginning the long process of becoming another scar on a hand that already carried too many. "Will he stay gone?" she asked. "Marcus is a coward. Cowards run from consequence, and the consequence of returning to the city is me. He'll stay gone." Elena nodded. She kept holding his hand. The bathroom was quiet except for the drip of the faucet she hadn't fully closed, and the distant sound of Agatha moving through the kitchen downstairs. "Lucien." "Yeah." "When Dominic showed us the file, when he said the agency was a front, that I'd been placed here." Lucien's hand tensed in hers. "You believed it," Elena said. "For a moment. You looked at me and you believed I was part of it." Silence. The faucet dripped. 3 drops. 4. "Yes," Lucien said. The honesty was brutal, not because it was cruel. Lucien didn't do cruelty toward Elena. Not anymore. Maybe not ever, but because it was complete. No justification, no explanation, no softening, just the raw, undecorated admission of a man who had doubted the woman he loved and was not going to insult her by pretending otherwise. "For how long?" Elena asked. 11 seconds. "You counted." "I count everything. It's a sickness." He paused. 11 seconds where every survival instinct I have told me you were a weapon pointed at my chest. 11 seconds where I looked at you and saw what I've been trained to see in everyone. The angle, the motive, the hidden architecture of betrayal. And then? And then I looked at your hands. Elena frowned. My hands? Your hands were shaking, not the way someone shakes when they're caught, not adrenaline, not performance. You were shaking the way you shook the first night I met you when you were on your knees scrubbing blood off my floor. The same frequency, the same pattern, the tremor of a person who is genuinely, physically, cellularly afraid. He turned his hand over in hers, lacing their fingers together. I've spent my life studying people's bodies for lies. I know what deception looks like in the muscles, in the pupils, in the breath pattern. Your body wasn't lying. It couldn't lie. The fear was real. And if the fear was real, then you were real. And if you were real, then everything I felt was real. And that was when the 11 seconds ended. Elena lifted his hand. She pressed her lips against the scarred knuckles, gently, carefully, the way you press your lips against something sacred, something that has survived damage it was never supposed to survive. Don't doubt me again, she said. I won't. You might, when things get hard, when someone whispers something in your ear. When Dominic looks at me like a threat assessment, you might doubt me again. Then remind me. How? Like this. Exactly like this. Hold my hand and tell me the truth, and let me see your face when you say it. That's all I've ever needed from anyone, and no one has ever given it to me until you. Elena felt something break open inside her chest. Not the sharp, jagged breaking of damage, but the slow, warm breaking of something thawing after a long freeze, ice becoming water, becoming something that could move and flow and nourish instead of just protect. She leaned forward and kissed him, not the desperate, consuming kiss of the night before the war. This was different, slower, softer. The kiss of two people who had survived something together and were only now beginning to understand that surviving was not the same as living, and that the distance between the two was measured not in time, but in the willingness to remain open to each other when every instinct demanded they close. Lucien's unwounded hand came up and held the back of her neck. His fingers threaded through her hair. He kissed her back with the concentrated attention he brought to everything. Completely, precisely, as though kissing her were the most important task he'd been assigned, and he intended to execute it perfectly. When they separated, his forehead rested against hers. Their breathing synced, in and out, in and out. I want to adopt Rosie, he said. Elena pulled back. She searched his face. He looked back at her with absolute stillness. No uncertainty, no hesitation, no room between the words and the meaning behind them. With Marcus's parental rights terminated, there's no legal obstacle. I've already consulted my attorneys. The process takes 3 to 6 months. I want to begin immediately. Lucien, you don't have to. I'm not doing this because I have to. I'm doing this because that child called me Lucien and asked me if the monsters came, and I realized that I would burn every empire I've ever built to make sure she never has to ask that question again. I want her to be mine, legally, permanently. Not because I own her. I don't own anyone, and I never will. But because she deserves a father who would die for her, and I am that man, and I want the law and the world and Elena Vale to know it. Elena's eyes filled. Not the burning, desperate tears of the past weeks, not the tears of fear or exhaustion or shame. These were different. These came from somewhere she'd forgotten existed, somewhere beneath the scar tissue and the survival mechanisms and the years of teaching herself that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Okay, she whispered. Okay? Okay, yes, okay, Lucien exhaled. The breath left his body like something that had been trapped inside him for years, decades maybe, a lifetime of compressed air finally finding an exit. His shoulders dropped, his spine relaxed. The coiled, perpetual readiness that lived in every muscle and every tendon and every fiber of his being loosened by a single, barely perceptible degree. It was the most relaxed Elena had ever seen him. 3 months later, they stood in a courthouse. Elena wore a blue dress she'd bought with her own money. The first purchase she'd made with money she'd earned herself since moving into the Ashcroft estate, because Lucien had hired her as the estate's operations manager at a salary that was generous but not absurd, because he understood, without being told, that Elena needed to earn and not just receive. Rosie wore a white dress with yellow flowers and shoes she'd picked out herself. Sparkly silver, wildly impractical. The clear choice of a 3-year-old with strong opinions and no interest in compromise. Lucien wore a black suit. He always wore a black suit. But this one was different, new, precise, chosen specifically for this occasion with a care that Elena recognized as significant, because Lucien did not care about clothes in general, but cared enormously about things that mattered. The judge signed the adoption papers at 10:47 a.m. It took less than 5 minutes. A lifetime of violence and fear and running and surviving reduced to a signature and a stamp and a piece of paper that said Rosie Vale was now Rosie Moretti. Rosie didn't understand the legal significance. She understood cake, which Agatha had waiting at the house, and she understood that Lucien was now officially her dad, which she accepted with the pragmatic indifference of a child who had considered this to be self-evident for months, and was mildly annoyed that the adults had taken so long to formalize the obvious. They drove home. Rosie fell asleep in her car seat with frosting on her chin and Gerald on her lap. Elena sat in the front seat with Lucien's hand resting on her knee, his thumb tracing slow circles against her kneecap, a small, absent-minded gesture that contained more tenderness than any grand declaration he could have made. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way Elena hadn't known quiet could be. Not the empty quiet of isolation, not the tense quiet of waiting for the next blow. A full quiet. A quiet occupied by Rosie's laughter in the garden and the sound of Lucien reading bedtime stories in a voice that could order men's fates by morning, and the smell of Agatha's cooking drifting through hallways that no longer felt like corridors in a fortress, but like the bones of a home. Lucien changed the empire. Not overnight. Men like Lucien didn't do overnight. They did systematic, they did methodical, they did permanent. But the direction shifted. The gambling operations were sold or shuttered. The money that had funded them was redirected into neighborhood clinics, housing programs, school funding in districts the city government had abandoned. The networks that had once moved contraband now moved resources, medical supplies, building materials, legal aid for families who couldn't afford attorneys. The city still called him dangerous. They were right to. Lucien Moretti remained exactly what he had always been, a man who responded to threats with overwhelming, disproportionate, merciless force. Traffickers who operated in his territory disappeared. Predators who targeted children in his neighborhoods were found and dealt with in ways that the police chose not to investigate too closely. The machinery of violence didn't stop. It was redirected, refocused, aimed with surgical precision at the things that deserved to be destroyed. Elena didn't pretend this was clean. She didn't tell herself fairy tales about the man she loved. She knew what Lucien was. She knew what he did. She knew that the hands that held her at night were the same hands that delivered consequences during the day, and she carried that knowledge the way a doctor carries the knowledge of mortality. Not with denial, not with romance, but with the clear-eyed acceptance that the world is built on difficult truths, and the people who navigate it best are the ones who stop pretending otherwise. Dominic remained. He never apologized for the conversation in the hallway, the one where he'd called Elena a project, a weakness, a liability. But something changed between them, a gradual, grudging thaw that expressed itself not in words, but in small acts of acknowledgement, a nod in the hallway, a door held open, a coffee left on the kitchen counter in the mug Elena always used. She didn't trust him. She didn't need to. She understood him, and understanding was enough. 6 months after the night the city burned, Lucien took Elena and Rosie to Sicily. Not a vacation. Lucien didn't take vacations. He relocated operations temporarily. But something close. A villa on the coast that had belonged to his family before his family had been destroyed, restored now, the stone walls repaired, the gardens replanted, the ghosts that lived in the rooms quietly, respectfully, displaced by the sound of a child running through hallways that had been silent for decades. They stood on the terrace on the second evening. Below them, the Mediterranean stretched toward the horizon in a sheet of impossible blue, the water catching the last light of the sun and holding it the way cupped hands hold something precious. Rosie was in the garden below, chasing lizards across the stone walls with Gerald tucked under one arm, her laughter rising into the warm air like something released. Lucien stood behind Elena. His arms were around her waist. His chin rested against her temple. She could feel his heartbeat against her back, slow, steady, the resting rhythm of a man who had finally, after a lifetime of sustained combat, found a place where his body was willing to stand down. "Do you remember the first night?" Elena asked. "Which part?" "The part where I was on my knees scrubbing blood off your floor and you asked me my name." "I remember everything about the first night. I remember the bus transfer stub in your jacket pocket. I remember the scuff pattern on your shoes. I remember the exact shade of brown in your eyes when you looked up at me and lied about being cold. I wasn't lying. I was cold. You were terrified. I was terrified and cold. Both things can be true." Lucien's arms tightened around her, a fractional increase in pressure that said more than any words could have conveyed. "I knew," he said quietly, "that first night. I knew you were going to change everything. I didn't know how. I didn't know the shape of it, but I felt it. The way you feel a storm coming before the sky changes. Something in the pressure. Something in the air. I looked at you kneeling on my floor with blood on your hands, and I thought, this woman is going to cost me everything I've built. And I decided I didn't care." Elena turned in his arms. She faced him. The sunset painted his face in gold and amber, softening the hard edges, filling the shadows beneath his eyes, making him look not younger, not kinder, not gentler, but illuminated, visible. Seen in the way that only happens when someone is willing to look at all of you, the beauty and the wreckage both, and stay. She reached up and touched the scar on his left hand, the one he pressed his fingers against when he thought no one was looking. She traced it from base of thumb to wrist, following the raised ridge of tissue, reading the story written there in a language she had learned from her own scars. "I used to think scars were things to hide," she said. "Proof that someone broke you. Evidence of damage, things you covered with long sleeves and high collars, and lies about being clumsy." She turned slightly, reached behind her, and lifted the back of her shirt. The 4 burns on her upper back were exposed to the warm evening air, pale, ridged, permanent. She had stopped hiding them 2 months ago, had stopped flinching when Lucien touched them, had stopped feeling them as marks of shame, and started feeling them as what they actually were. "Now I think they're timestamps," she said. "Proof that you were alive on the worst day of your life. Proof that the thing that tried to destroy you failed. Not because you were strong enough to stop it, but because you were stubborn enough to keep breathing after it happened." Lucien looked at the scars on her back. He reached out and touched them the way he had in the library that first time. 2 fingers, light pressure, the warmth of his skin against the dead nerve endings of ruined tissue. But this time there was no flinch, no recoil, no involuntary flash of a memory she'd spent years trying to outrun, just his hand on her skin and the Mediterranean wind and Rosie's laughter in the garden below. "I don't deserve you," Lucien said. "Probably not. I'm serious. So am I. You don't deserve me. I don't deserve you. Rosie doesn't deserve any of this. Deserving has nothing to do with anything. We're here because we chose to be, every day, over and over. That's not destiny. That's not fate. That's stubbornness. And stubbornness is the only thing in this world that actually works." Lucien looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, not a crack, not a fracture, not a momentary lapse in the architecture of his composure. Lucien Moretti smiled. It transformed his face, not into something soft, not into something safe, into something human. Fully, completely, irreversibly human. The smile of a man who had spent his entire life being feared and had finally found the one thing more powerful than fear, the choice to stay. Elena smiled back. She leaned into his chest. He wrapped his arms around her. They stood on the terrace of a villa on the coast of Sicily while the sun went down and the sea turned from blue to gold to black, and their daughter chased lizards in the garden with a chewed stuffed elephant, and the world, the vast, violent, merciless, occasionally beautiful world, continued to turn around them without requiring their permission or their attention or anything at all except their willingness to remain standing in it, together, scarred and stubborn and alive. Below the terrace, Rosie caught a lizard. She held it up triumphantly, her small hand gentle around its body, her face lit with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child who has never known the kind of fear that requires a safe room. "Lucien," she called, "look, I caught a dragon." Lucien looked down at his daughter. The word still hit him somewhere he didn't have armor, somewhere the scars hadn't reached, a place he hadn't known existed until a 3-year-old girl walked into his study holding a stuffed elephant and asked if he wanted to see it. "Be gentle with it," he called back. "I know, Gerald taught me." Elena laughed. The sound rose from the terrace and joined Rosie's laughter in the garden and floated out over the stone walls and across the water and disappeared into the darkening sky. And for a moment, one single, perfect, unrepeatable moment, the world sounded exactly the way it was supposed to. Lucien pressed his lips against Elena's hair. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For making me remember what this feels like." What feels like? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She already knew. It felt like home. And standing there on the terrace with the man who had burned down half a city to protect her, Elena Vale, who had survived a monster and loved a monster and learned the difference between the two, finally stopped being afraid. Not because the world had become safe. It hadn't. It never would. Because she had become someone who could stand inside the danger and choose to stay anyway. And that, she understood now, was the only kind of courage that mattered. The kind that doesn't come from being unbreakable. The kind that comes from being broken and choosing every single morning to get back up.